I think there are a number of features which are important to recognise in relation to the water sector. And I think the first one to state is that the water industry is a success. Since privatisation in 1989, it's a country which has purer drinking water, more secure drinking water, and cleaner rivers, estuaries, and bathing beaches. And that, of course, is a product of a whole range of organisations and activities. And I think what's really important to recognise is that this has been enabled by a stable and predictable regulatory regime. And it's a regulatory regime which works. It's worked in the past and continues to work. And I think the other feature of this as well is that it's largely free of political interference. And I think that's a very, very positive dimension to how things are run. And of course, what that's created is an inflow of £100 billion of private capital investment into water companies, into the water sector. There are, of course, many other entities involved in similar infrastructure as well. The Environment Agency, of course, is a key part of that. If you look at the future, there are a number of things that I think we'd all recognise we need to take account of, which are obviously population growth, economic growth, and climate change. All those things add up to potentially greater pressure on the water environment. And if you just take one of those as an example, climate change, clearly there are two dimensions to this. There's the security of supply, which is perhaps a very obvious concern, but there's also the increased level of risk of flooding, which is perhaps counterintuitive when we just think of a kind of warmer world. And of course, these are things which many parts of the UK, Yorkshire included, particularly in 2007, suffered very, very significantly from. Now, of course, a lot of work's been done since then in terms of Smythe Pitt's review and the recent changes to legislation, which go a long way to improving that situation.
There's a massive role, I think, for water companies to play in flood defences and everything that stems from that. And I think as well, there's an emerging theme in all, if you like, utility politics, not just, this is what I'd like the bill to address when it eventually appears, not just water industry politics, but utility politics, in that there's a sweet spot to be found when we look at social policy objectives, economic policy objectives, and environmental policy objectives. And I think we can find that sweet spot, and that sweet spot is when all of those three areas actually converge on a single project or a single policy area. And I think we can do that in water by, if you look at some of the environmental improvements that can be made by investing in the water industry, and then if you then look at the economic improvements that can then be achieved in a local area from that same investment, then you're all of the time hitting those objectives, social, environmental, economic. And I'd like to see that underpin an integrated policy approach in the white paper.
Who's got the best model, do you think, in terms of integrated water management? Adrian, do you have some insight into that experience?
That's a difficult question. The Dutch clearly do very well with their visions of how they're going to deal with flooding in the future. They already have their visualizations of essentially floating communities. So the Dutch run a very integrated water system, but then they have to, because they're at the bottom end of everyone's sewage works in most of Europe. So they have an issue, and something like half the land is below sea level. So they have to be very good and very integrated. Somewhere like Singapore, in a rather different way, has some excellent new systems for taking wastewater and cleaning it up to the point where you could. There's philosophical difficulties, but you could drink it straight out of those drinking
toilet to tap.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're faced with is, in this country, people expect the water to come from somewhere beautiful.
Yeah.
So you can't really feed it directly, and you have to have a sort of golden mile of river or something like that. And in fact, you then have to clean the water up again because the quality's deteriorated in the river. But nonetheless, there's plenty of examples of very good integrated systems. But the UK is up there with some of the very best. Let's be very clear that in the year 2000 in The Hague, there was the worldwide interministerial meeting on water, which set the whole agenda for the Johannesburg World Agreements. 3 out of the 4 technical experts at that meeting were from this city. So it does indicate that we have some worldwide recognition of expertise.
It's an asset for Leeds.
Yeah, but let me go back to one other comment you made about, if you like, Leeds Council. As I said, I chair the Strategic Regional Flood Defence Partnership, and I can assure you that Leeds, both politically and in terms of their expertise officers, have been represented, as well as all the other local authorities and Yorkshire Water and the planning groups. For the first time, we're starting to get that assembly together. Okay. Now, it's slow progress, but as Mark said, some of the smaller authorities have only got a handful or less people. But if we can say, well, what expertise do you have between the 5 of you, and what resources do you have between the 5 or 6 authorities, and how can a company like Yorkshire Water add into it, and how can we change the planning to be a bit more responsive, then we start to get to a position where we can plan more effectively for flooding.
I think the thing we're starting to lift the lid on, and we really don't understand the size of the problem, is surface water flooding. And it plays into how the size of the sewage system, the things that are going into its capacity. And I think in the partnership we have at Hull, we're starting to understand actually, if you really want to manage risk down to the level that people are now starting to expect, and that's, I think, a political debate about what level of risk we want to manage, then the level of investment we're talking about is just off the scale. I mean, the kind of monies we're talking about now would look fairly paltry, actually, because to try and create a kind of Singapore kind of infrastructure is no mean feat. It might be the right thing to do in the longer term, but it's certainly a different ballpark, and therefore I think this kind of conversation about how you would access really big funds in the future is really very, very important. So I just wanted, I think we've got a good handle on some of it. There's some bits we really just start to unpick which look very, very expensive and problematic.